Today you're going to find out why your opening is against e4 never worked, and how I stopped losing and started winning by playing the French defense. Go ahead and steal my ideas and tricks that turn this setup into a rock-solid, hard-hitting counterattack. So yeah, no messing around, I'm Philip, let's jump right in. And here you answer with e6, going straight into the French defense. With this move, you already shut down a bunch of quick attacking ideas that could come from bishop to c4, hitting the pawn on f7. Normally, white follows up with d4, and you immediately strike back with d5. First up, we get into the advanced variation. This is the backbone of our French studies, because it's exactly where we get the classic pawn structure with pawns on d4, e5, e6, and d5. And it's really important that you understand the ideas behind this pawn chain, because once you get this structure, you don't need to memorize theory anymore. You'll always have a basic plan in mind just because of the pawn structure. And with it, white ends up getting more space in the center and also on the king side. Basically, you've got two main pawn breaks to go after white's white's center, the c5 break and the f6 break. The f6 break takes a bit more prep because you can weaken your own king, so it usually comes later on in the middle game. So early on, what really makes the most sense for you is to grab space on the queen side and go straight at the pawn chain with pawn to c5. This move is simply the strongest in the position, and it's something you've got to play right now. If, for example, you go for something off, like knight to c6, your position already falls apart. Everything gets cramped, the bishop can't get out, the queen struggles to develop, and you're just sitting there with less space on the board. That's why pawn to c5 is essential here. Of course, white is going to try to hold the center, and most of the time they answer with c3, defending the base of the pawn chain. From here on, your plan in the French defense is straightforward. You're going to organize your piece development to crank up as much pressure as possible on the d4 square, basically lining up almost all your pieces to target that central point. And that's where the secret kicks in that turns the French defense from something that just looks solid into a real attacking setup. At first glance, it might seem like white's in control because of that pawn chain, but in reality, you're already sitting on pressure that can blow their whole position apart. And if you don't see that, you end up playing like you're the one who's worse. So for example, after knight to f3, you go queen to b6, and now white's facing another big decision. They can choose bishop to d3, setting up a trap, or they can go bishop to e2 instead. Let's start with bishop to e2, getting ready to castle. Here, I just stick with normal development and play knight to e7, with a clear idea of later rerouting that knight toward f5 or g6. Either way, you're keeping close tabs on white's central pawns, and where that knight finally lands really depends on what your opponent decides to do. Usually, white waits for you to cover that bishop before grabbing the pawn. The reason's pretty simple. If they take it right away, you recapture while developing with the bishop, and now your position feels really comfortable, even putting pressure on the pawn on f2. Once white goes bishop to e2, when you kind of block the bishop's line of sight, he ends up feeling more forced to take the pawn. In that spot, instead of recapturing with queen to c5, the best move is to drop the queen back to c7 and start aiming at your opponent's central pawn, keeping the initiative on your side. If white tries to hang on to the defense of the pawn on e5, for example by playing bishop to f4, you can just respond with knight to g6, attacking the bishop while at the same time renewing the pressure on the pawn, and this sequence ends up winning that pawn. In other words, there really is no solid defense for the pawn on e5. Your opponent basically gets forced to let it go. In the sequence of exchanges involving the knights, he still has to try to support the pawn on c5 by playing pawn to b4. This line is usually very good for you. Just look at the pawn structure. The opponent ends up with doubled pawns in a really strange structure, and the pawn on c3 becomes a pretty weak target, and with that, you get a very comfortable game to convert as the game goes on. But there is also another possibility. Instead of capturing this pawn, your opponent can simply go on with normal development, for example, castling. In this position, you develop the knight to f5, increasing the pressure on the pawn on d4 and forcing your opponent to capture it, which helps you gain time developing pieces. Now, the other possibility, after queen to b6, your opponent can play bishop to d3, looking to set a trap. The point is, the bishop steps in front of the queen, and up until now, the queen was defending the pawn on d4, but with the bishop on that square, that defense is no longer there. So you might be wondering, is that pawn gonna fall? You're already attacking it once, twice, 3 times, while it's only defended twice. In practice, that pawn doesn't fall, because if you just take on d4 and white recaptures, you can't keep taking because there comes knight takes, queen takes, and at the end of that sequence, white gets bishop to b5 check, and you end up losing your queen. That's the idea behind the Milner-Barry Gambit, and if you've never heard of it, it's by far the most dangerous gambit against the French defense. The worst part is, even if you defend it correctly, the follow-up can be nastier than the initial sack, and I already made a full video on this here on the channel. I'll drop the link in the card so you can watch it later, but for now, stick with me. And to avoid falling for this gambit, you can't just take the pawn on d4. First, you go bishop to d7, getting ready to take it safely. Look, white might even sack that pawn chain to go for compensation, but a lot of opponents prefer to avoid it and try something else. A common mistake is to play bishop to e3 because that move hangs the pawn on b2. From there, you hit the rook, and that puts white in serious trouble. Another option is to pull the bishop back, allowing the queen to cover the pawn, which is way more solid. Then comes a knight to b4 attacking move. It's true that this move doesn't win right away, but starting that trade is great for you, and white can't really stop it. If they try bishop to b3, the best thing you can do is bring the bishop to b5 or the queen to a6. That way, you stop white from castling, and on the next move, no matter what they play, you go knight to d3 check, an extremely annoying resource. And here, in fact, the move simply wins the game because you go straight along the diagonal with the queen, and white doesn't want to leave the king stuck in a pin. If the king goes to d2, you go knight to f2, hitting the queen and the rook at the same time. So, yeah, the game is basically over. Because white has no way to protect the bishop, they're forced to sacrifice it, and then let's say they proceed to castle and you capture the bishop immediately. After that, white completely loses the attacking potential against your king side, even if you go for a short castle later. And I'm already super comfortable in this position. From there, you just follow the natural plan of developing the rook to c8, bringing one more piece into the game, and also going after the enemy queen. Then, knight to c3, and now I've really got to talk about kingside development. But this knight's kind of a problem. You can't drop it on the natural square because you get snapped up by a pawn. So what do? As usual, the solution is to change the knight's route and develop it via e7. And after white plays something like bishop to e3, that knight can either jump to c6, going after the pawn, or head to f5, where it's also hitting that same pawn. And honestly, f5 is a great square. There you're aiming at the pawn and you can hassle the bishop. And that's how it turns into a really active piece on the board. The white pieces, in turn, might start to worry about the pawn on d4, and also about that pin. For that reason, say they play queen to d2. Here you develop the bishop to e7, and at first glance, it looks pretty much the same. But strategically, white's already in trouble because you're going to keep putting pressure on that pawn in the middle game. If rook to c1 comes, you castle, and later place the rook on c4, adding even more pressure on that pawn. Then double up on the c-file. The main point is that you just keep attacking along the c-file, always building more pressure on that pawn, and for white, it gets harder and harder to come up with any active plan. So now we're stepping into the main line, the one that usually shows up when your opponent plays more accurately. In this position, after pressuring the pawn on d4, you're already set to take it. Trying to hold on with something like bishop to c2, yeah, that just doesn't work in practice, and it leaves the position super passive. From here, you can start chasing that bishop, push it off the board, and drive the position even deeper into defensive mode. That's why a lot of times they'll just sack the pawn on d4 since there's no clean way to defend it, hoping for some kind of compensation. Let's say they proceed to castle and you go ahead and take on d4. Now you're up a pawn, and they reply with knight to c3. The idea is to pick up some development tempo and even down material. Try to whip up a quick attack before your own setup is fully in place. But right here, there are a few tricks you've got to watch out for. I stick to a simple rule here. Don't get greedy, and don't take the pawn on e5, because that just slows down your development. So instead of grabbing material, you go for a super useful prophylactic move, pawn to a6. Without that, they might have some tricks with knight to b5 and a few attacking ideas. But once you've got pawn to a6 on the board, most of that stuff gets shut down. And if you take a moment and really look at their setup, it's not that easy to see where any real attacking plan is supposed to come from. Meanwhile, your queen keeps the pressure going. And if they just move the bishop, you're fine trading queens and heading into a winning endgame. The tension on that pawn on e5 is still there, and yeah, maybe you grab it later, but for now, it already forces them to worry about how they're going to hold it. If they go for something like queen to e2 to defend, you just keep developing clean, smooth, natural. Just a quick reminder here that knight isn't going to f6. It comes out to e7, and from there it usually heads to either f5 or c6. But in this position, knight to f5 doesn't feel great, because it can just get taken, and that messes up your pawn structure. So most likely, you're dropping it on c6 next, and that just ramps up the pressure on that pawn. And I'm totally fine with the sequence. You've already got an extra pawn, and once the knight lands on c6, your setup's super solid. Your defense covers all the key zones, while you're still keeping up the heat on that pawn. They might try bishop to e3, but that blocks the queen's diagonal, and when that happens, you just take the pawn on e5. After that, it's hard for them to build any kind of real attack. In this position, I noticed that one of the more common practical moves is white going pawn to f4. The idea is pretty clear, because they know you're targeting that central pawn chain, so they try to reinforce it. But in practice, that move backfires because the move overloads white's position without enough support and makes your attacking job easier. After pawn to f4, the follow-up is simple queen to b6, attacking that pawn a third time. And now the threat's real, because if white doesn't defend it, you just take it. So they pretty much have to cover, and they go knight to f3. At this point, I'm already looking at how to crank up the pressure on that pawn one more time. There's a super common maneuver where you reroute your knight to f5, either through e7 or h6. Both routes work great. You can go knight to h6 and then knight to f5, and now you're hitting that pawn on d4 again. You might be wondering if that pawn's even a real problem for white, and what happens if they just trade it off. Sure, that kind of solves the immediate issue, but your position's still totally fine because first off, you're developing your bishop with tempo. On top of that, you grab in control of the diagonal that aims right at the king, setting up stuff like bishop to f2 check. And from there, white can't really castle safely anymore. You can also keep going with the knight, for example, jumping to g4 and then f2. So in practice, that trade doesn't actually fix everything. That's why most of the time, instead of simplifying, white tries to hold on to that pawn and finds some way to keep it defended. So how do they try to hold on to that pawn? One of the more common blunders is that white just keeps developing, something like bishop to e2. At first glance, it looks totally normal, but that's exactly when you start winning a ton of games with a really straightforward idea. You take here, and after the trades, you bring the knight to f5, hitting that pawn for the third time. White's got it covered twice, but there's just no way to defend it a third time. So, next move, you're picking up the pawn. On top of that, this whole sequence opens up that diagonal again for the recapture, and now white's in real trouble. They might try to patch things up with bishop to e3, but you just take it, grab the bishop pair, and walk away with a strategic edge. If your opponent's more experienced, it's pretty common to see bishop to d3. That's basically the right approach for white. From there, that bishop controls the f5 square, so if you send the knight there, they can just trade it off. That trade by itself isn't really an issue for you, because you still keep the bishop pair, and white holds the position and keeps that pawn. And here, if you've been following what we looked at earlier, you can take one glance at the board and spot the trap. It's the exact same idea as before. The Milner-Barry all over again. So you already know the fix. Go bishop to d7. From that move on, everything clicks into place, and now the threat of taking the pawn on b4 becomes real. White needs to react, so they go bishop to c2. That activates the queen and lets them defend the pawn one more time. From here, there are a few ways to handle the position, but I like something a bit more subtle. Rook to c8. Most of the time, white just castles, and that's when you've got a tactical shot coming up. It all starts with the trade on d4. Over time, that pawn turns into a real weakness and becomes an obvious target, and that's exactly why we drop the rook on c8. The c-file opens up, the rook becomes active, and you can start leaning on that pressure. One of the most common ways to push it even further is knight to b4, which often ends up being a really strong move for us. Same thing here. You keep going after the bishop, and that alone already puts white in a pretty uncomfortable spot. If you manage to trade your knight for their bishop, that's actually great for you, because in positions like this, especially in the French, the bishop tends to be a bit stronger than the knight. In this structure, the light-squared bishop is active, while the dark-squared one usually just sits there, so trading it off is always a win for you. But in this position, instead of going knight to b4, there's an even stronger idea. Knight takes on d4. You're sacking the knight temporarily, but you get the material back, and with interest. White can recapture with the queen or the knight, but neither works. And if queen takes on d4, it's basically game over. First off, that bishop is hanging, but even stronger than that, you go bishop to c5, and now the queen's pinned to the king. That whole sequence is just brutal for white. So what should white have done to avoid all this? Well, the best move was actually to take back with the knight. Then you go bishop to c5, and you can already see how their position starts to fall apart. That knight's pinned, your rook's pressuring the c-file, and the only way to defend the knight is with bishop to e3. But that weakens the pawn on b2, so you just take it, now threatening the rook on a1. The only way to save the rook is to drop a knight on d2. But then you go bishop takes on d4, and right here, your position just starts taking over. You're grabbing everything. The bishops are staring each other down, and your queen's also hitting the other bishop on c2. If they take, you respond with queen takes on d4, check, and that forces the king to move. Now, before going for more material, you've got to keep in mind one of black's classic problems in the French, that light-squared bishop stuck on d7. It usually gets boxed in by your own pawn chain. So, anytime you find a way to free it, you've got to take that shot. Here you go, bishop to b5, repositioning it to a way more active diagonal and already hitting the rook. The rook has to deal with that, and the most likely reply here is rook to a3. That's when you hit him with a really strong move. Bishop to e2, attacking the queen and pulling it off the defense of the rook on a1. And that way, you end up taking the rook with check. And your rook is still super active on the c-file, pressuring that bishop on c2. And now it's pretty clear that ever since that d4 pawn fell, white's whole setup is just collapsing. And from here, it gets way easier to convert your advantage. Let's go back to the starting point of this line and check out a few other options white might throw at you and how to deal with them in practice. One move they might try is bishop to b5, because they know you're going to start putting pressure on the center, so they bring the bishop out early and pin your knight. But here, the response is super straightforward. Bishop to d7, breaking the pin right away. And this is where pretty slick tactic comes in. If white keeps developing and goes knight to f3, you've actually got a killer move. Knight takes e5, grabbing a free pawn. The trick is this. By taking on e5, you're setting up a discovered attack on white's bishop. If they take your knight, you just take their bishop and you're up a pawn. And if they go after your bishop instead, you just recapture on d7 with the knight, still ending up a clean pawn ahead either way. So this little tactic already gives you a really nice position. Now, jumping back to that starting setup, there's still one more trap experienced players might try to throw at you. So, at this point, you already know there's the threat of knight takes c5, which is why a stronger opponent will usually go ahead and trade on c6 first. You recapture, and then white plays knight to f3, and now things are more or less equal. This simplification actually works in your favor strategically, because now it's clear white no longer has their light-squared bishop, which is a key piece for any kind of middle game attacking chances. From this point on, once you castle, there's no bishop on d3 aiming at your king anymore. So it's way harder for white to build up any real pressure. So for now, you should be pretty happy with the position you've got. But this is where that trap I mentioned shows up. Right around here, you might be tempted to go bishop to b5, trying to cut off the king's connection. They can't castle anymore, and at first glance, the position even looks really good for you. But that's exactly what white is waiting for. In practice, this continuation actually gets black into trouble, and it's worth seeing why. So here, white goes pawn to a4. You drop the bishop back to a6, your opponent captures on c5, you recapture, and that's where the problem shows up. Pawn to b4 comes in, hitting the bishop, and as soon as it slips away, pawn to b5 follows, and that pawn push just wins the piece. This is a trap that really feels like a kind of Noah's Ark, and it ends up catching even pretty experienced players. But once you know the idea, it's actually pretty easy to get out of it. The whole trick to completely neutralizing this threat is just a small tweak in the move order. After knight to f3, it's worth taking a closer look at the position. So instead of going bishop to b5 right away, the simplest solution, if you really want to stick with that plan, is to capture on d4 first. After that trade, everything's basically fixed, and only then do you go bishop to b5. And now the position's nice and comfortable because white just can't trap your bishop anymore with those pawn pushes. In fact, it's white who ends up having to be careful here because they've got to fight just to get any kind of initiative. So after covering the main themes of the advanced variation, we now get to white's strongest reply, which is the classical variation, with knight to c3. Here, white chooses to keep the central tension. Capturing the pawn would lead to a completely symmetrical position, while pushing would lock things up into a closed position, something I'll come back to later because there are some really interesting ideas behind it. But for now, the most direct way to go is to capture the pawn on e4, and right away you're locking in an open asymmetrical position. White recaptures with the knight, and this whole setup where black takes the pawn and the knight recaptures is what's known as the Rubinstein variation. From here, there were a bunch of ways to continue, but the moves that really make sense are bishop to e7 and knight to d7. Black would like to bring the knight out to f6, getting a piece toward the center, but if you do that right now, white just captures that knight. You can recapture with the queen to avoid doubling your pawns, but then white goes knight to f3, and when they develop their bishop, they end up doing it with tempo, hitting your queen and gaining that extra move. In this position, you end up having to waste an extra tempo with something like pawn to h6. By the time you get here, you're already 2 moves behind in development, while white keeps going with moves like bishop to d3, and that gets pretty uncomfortable for the side playing black. That's why you really don't want to allow that trade, because you're paying a price either way. Either you have to move the queen way too early to a square where it can get hit, or you end up doubling your own pawns by recapturing with the g-pawn. So the developing moves you choose here really need to make sure that trade never even happens, dodging this whole problem and leaving you with your queen nicely placed on f6. That's why moves like knight to d7 really make the most sense. So after white keeps developing with knight to f3, you go knight to f6, and now that trade just isn't appealing for them anymore. At that point, they've got to decide, either trade since the knight isn't defended, or burn a move trying to protect it. Either way, you don't end up sliding your queen over to f6. If they choose to trade, you get a knight sitting really nicely on f6, which is way more comfortable for your position. In this variation, I really like pushing you to go all in with a kingside attack against your opponent. One of white's most common developing moves here is bishop to d3. From there, you can go bishop to d6, pointing straight at the opponent's kingside. After white castles, you castle as well, and then the other bishop comes out via the fianchetto, leaving you with 2 really active bishops aiming right at the enemy kingside. For example, first you go b6 and then bishop to b7, and now those 2 bishops get insanely strong, putting direct pressure on white's castled position. From this structure, it's just really natural to start lining up a serious attack. So this is a really solid alternative. And now I want to show you that closed position with the interesting ideas I promised. Knight to f6. White pushes a pawn, and this closed structure has a few neat subtleties that are definitely worth getting to know. So you follow up with knight to d7, and unlike the other line, since white can't go c3 here, they try f4 to grab more control over e5, already anticipating that c5 is going to come and that black will start putting pressure on d4. A really typical sequence is knight to f3, you go knight to c6, and then they develop with bishop to e3. From here, you get ready to wrap up development with bishop to e7 so you can castle. For example, they go bishop to e2, both sides castle, and now the position is basically set. In this structure, you've always got the option of throwing in f6 at some point to get counterplay going in the center. Another really important idea is to push a6 and b5 to start getting counterplay on the queen side, with plans like b4, a5, and bishop to a6 looking to trade off white's light-squared bishop. This really matters, because one of the classic features of the French defense is that the bishop on c8 often turns into a bad bishop since it gets stuck behind its own pawn chain. So, one of the main themes in this opening is really trying to trade off that light-squared bishop whenever you can. And to see how this idea plays out in real games, let's jump into the Tarrasch variation, the line with knight to d2. White defends the pawn on e4 this way, and the move I like here is knight to f6, pushing white right back into that pawn chain structure we already know so well. A really typical sequence goes bishop to d3, you hit the base of the chain with c5, then c3 shows up. You develop with knight to c6, and white keeps going with knight to e2. The Tarrasch variation has a key feature here. White develops the knights to e2 and f3 specifically to overprotect the base on d4. Because of that, the whole strategy shifts a bit. after pawn takes, d4 is super well defended, so it's just not worth going for queen to b6. Instead, you go f6, hitting the pawn chain directly and freeing up your pieces. From here, white usually takes the pawn on f6, and then it just flows into knight to f6, knight to f3, you go bishop to d6, white castles, you castle too, and now the position is basically set. In this kind of structure, your whole middle game plan is to build counterplay along the semi-open f-file. Look for that e5 break at the right moment, and whenever you can, find ways to put pressure on the pawn on d4. That's the main game plan in this variation. Now there's a situation where you actually block your own pawn on purpose, and that ends up becoming the key to a direct attack. I'm talking about the exchange variation. This line isn't considered the strongest option for white because, like we already talked about, it leads to a completely symmetrical structure. In practice, nobody really gets a clear edge. You end up with 4 pawns on each side on the queen side, and the pawns get lined up in exactly the same way on d5. White's typical plan here is to develop with bishop to d3, and you answer with bishop to d6. The position stays symmetrical for a bit. Then comes knight to f3, you go knight to f6, white castles, you castle too. And from there, both sides start fighting for control of the open e-file. So here I want to push you to play a bit more ambitiously. Instead of just developing the bishop to d6 like most people do, I'd go for a slightly different move, knight to c6. At first glance, this move looks weird because in the French defense, you usually think about pushing the c-pawn, and sticking a knight right in front of it feels counterintuitive. The thing is, though, in this specific variation, you're not actually playing for that pawn push at all, so the plan shifts to castling long and then going after your opponent using the pawns on the king side. So following typical white moves, they might go c3 to firm things up, or just knight to f3. Either way, you stay with the plan and go bishop to g4, pinning your opponent's knight. By pinning the knight, you start threatening the capture of the pawn on d4, and white needs to react to defend it. For example, by playing pawn to c3. From there, you go bishop to d6, developing your second bishop already aimed at your opponent's king side. White castles, and now comes the key moment. Instead of going knight to f6 and thinking about castling short, you choose queen to d7. That move sets up long castling. If white goes for a check, that's totally fine. You just cover it with the knight. And if they go for a pin, that's not a big deal either, because you can still play f6, which also helps you get that pawn rolling to g5 later on. After long castling, you get a much more dynamic position that's way easier to attack with. And look what you've just pulled off here. Now you've got a solid opening that completely neutralizes those typical aggressive attacks white loves to throw at you. But here's the brutal truth you've got to face. What happens when you're the one playing white and your opponent goes for the French defense? You get that knot in your stomach, right? Because you know exactly how solid the French is. You just saw it. So go click on the video that's popping up on your screen right now, because I'm about to show you the 3 most deadly tactical lines against the French defense, including a devastating trick in the advanced variation that took me years of losing to finally figure out. Click it now, because every time you face the French without these weapons, you're going to freeze at the board with no clue what to do, because if you stop here, you already know how that story ends. If you enjoyed and learned something new, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.